My story today is about one of the central events of 20th century European history, an event which, if we have to give it a day, would have been the event that takes place on the 30th of January 1933, when Adolf Hitler, Times Man of the Year, when Adolf Hitler is appointed the Chancellor of the German Republic. It is a story whose significance, I think, we really would have trouble overestimating. I think it's pretty clear that without Hitler, there would have been no Second World War. There might have been conflicts in Europe, certainly, but I think the Second World War, certainly as it occurred, would not have happened had not a country as powerful as Germany fallen into the hands of someone who was committed to reshaping the geopolitical environment of Europe. And without a Second World War, there would have been no American engagement in Europe. There would have been no Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe. There would not have been a Cold War as it evolved, although there might well have been a global rivalry between these powers. There would have been no Holocaust. There would have been no State of Israel. In other words, it doesn't take long to work out a whole list of events that would have not have happened, or certainly would have happened in dramatically different ways, had things turned out differently on that 30th of January, 1933. Now, the Nazis themselves, while they were in power, always argued that the 1933 was the logical, inevitable outcome of German history. That Hitler, as he said again and again, Hitler was Germany. He personified its truest cultural, racial nature. And that he came to power was the inevitable consequence of this identification of the leader and its people. Ironically, some of the Nazis' most bitter enemies echoed this inevitability, because they too, although they gave it a quite different spin, a quite different kind of evaluation, Hitler's enemies also looked upon him and Nazism as the inevitable outcome of the German spirit, of German culture, of the flaws of German politics, of German class relations. There are a variety of versions of this. Some go back to the nature of German capitalism, some go back to Luther or Nietzsche or whoever. My main point today, and it's captured in the title on the question posed in the lecture outline, but my main theme today is that January 30th, 1933 was in no sense inevitable. It didn't have to happen. There was nothing, certainly nothing in the larger logic of German history, but not even anything in the immediate events much closer to the time that necessarily resulted in this outcome. It seems to me it's a much better, a better way of looking at this is to see it not as the inevitable unfolding of a historical process, but rather as the narrowing of a series of alternatives in which a series of choices made in a particular way lead to another, foreclose certain alternatives, open up others. So that when it happens, in a sense, January 30th, 1933 becomes inevitable, it's really only until very, very late in the day that every alternative but Hitler is closed out. The trick, I think, to historical explanation, the problem that all historians face, is to avoid the twin fallacies of inevitability and accident. Because this wasn't just an unfortunate and inadvertent event. It had a meaning, it had a sense, it had a logic. And it's uncovering that, it's watching that process. That will be what I'd like to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking to you about. Now, in order to talk about this as in the way that I want to, in order to look at this together the way I want us to, it's necessary, I think, to separate out two related but I think different questions. One is, why Hitler? And that's a German question. The other is, why does German democracy fail? That, I think, is a much larger, it's part of a much larger process. The two, as I said, are clearly related, but I think they bear a different kind of historical analysis. Because while Nazism is, I think, unique, democracy failed in much of Europe in the years between the wars. The failure of democracy was not a particularly German phenomenon. It happened within weeks in Hungary in 1919, happened 3 years after the war in Italy in 1922, happened in Spain in 1923, and then again in 1939. It happened in Poland, happened in Yugoslavia, it happened in Romania, it happened in almost all of the new states of Eastern and Central Europe, so that by the time war came in 1939, only the old democracies, France, Belgium, Holland, even there it's in trouble, Britain, the northern European states, only here has democracy made it through what was an extremely turbulent and difficult time. Democracies were done in, to tell a very long and complicated story in a very brief way, democracies were done in between the wars because they could not contain the kinds of conflicts that were generated largely by the First World War itself. National conflicts within and between states, economic and social conflicts among groups within states, and of course, political conflicts that emerge as states are unable to associate their legitimacy. There's a different way in which this happens in Spain or in Italy or in Hungary or in Poland, but much the same ingredients are present everywhere. And of course, they're present in Germany. Germany is the main combatant in the First World War. It's an extraordinary feat of military and economic mobilization to stay in the war as long as the Germans did. The German people think they're winning. And when the war finally ends in November of 1918, there are German armies occupying foreign territories all over Europe, deep into Eastern Europe, deep into France. It's only when the German military leadership realizes that they're hopelessly outgunned, that they have no chance of winning, that they decide that they're going to bring the war to an end. It comes as a big shock. And not surprisingly, a number of Germans ask themselves, how could this happen? The military, after insisting that the war come to an end, immediately tries to shift the blame to somebody else. Immediately tries to talk about the fact that the army was still victorious, but it was, in a phrase that worked its way into German political rhetoric, it was stabbed in the back. Stabbed in the back by civilians. Stabbed in the back by a government that let it down. Stabbed in the back by a sinister group of conspirators, communists, Jews, maybe big capitalists, maybe Catholics. Actual makeup of this conspiracy varied. Many Germans believed that that was the only explanation for how they could lose. So this defeat, the trauma of war, the belief in victory, and the terrible reality of defeat injected into German politics a poison that worked its way out for the next decade and more. The Germans, they're not, of course, the only country in the world ever to have tried this, The Germans paid for their war not by taxation, but by inflation, by selling bonds, by printing money, hoping that at some future date the people they defeated would pay for it all. The result of this, when the war ended, was a disaster for the German economy. Depreciating the currency, disrupting economic relationships, ruining whole sectors of the population. And of course, politically, the German government, now the new Republican government created in the debris of defeat, the German Republic had to bear the responsibility for the defeat, for the economic dislocations, and for the political violence that occurred unparalleled in modern German history, for the political violence that occurred in the war's immediate aftermath. A devastating concatenation of events. They come to a head in 1922 when the Germans are unable to pay the reparations bills that were imposed on them in the peace treaty. And French and Belgian troops invade the industrial heartland in order to impose penalties for failing to pay these reparations. Notice that the soldier in the middle is African, something that the Germans regarded as a particularly painful event, right? That these former enemies would send these troops from Africa into their, it was a particularly humiliating, tinged with a kind of racism that remains part of this whole game. And here, of course, is this German civilian in a kind of quasi-traditional garb, bravely looked upon by these heavily armed and menacing foreign troops. The German government responds to the invasion of the Ruhr by printing money. They tell the people in the Ruhr to engage in a kind of passive resistance, not to go to work, to strike. They pay for it by printing money in order to keep the economy going, and the result is a hyperinflation that essentially destroys the value of the currency. Here we see a housewife doing with this inflated currency one of the few things it was useful for, which was making a fire and trying to keep the house warm. It wasn't simply that inflation that many societies are accustomed to, always painful. It was an inflation that essentially, in the end, destroyed the value of money completely, and in the process ruined important social groups. People would get envelopes from the bank about their savings account, in which the stamp in the upper right-hand corner was worth more than the whole life savings that had once been part of their bank account. At the same time that there is an invasion of French and Belgian forces in the West, at the same time that the currency has collapsed, there are a series of armed uprisings throughout Germany, a communist uprising in Saxony, and then an uprising in Munich by a new and somewhat obscure political group called the National Socialist Workers' Party under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. This is not 1923, which is what I hoped it was before I looked more closely at it. This is a kind of a reproduction of the march, which becomes a part of Nazi ceremonies ever after. Foreign invasion, national problems, economic collapse, political violence and chaos. But, and that's the purpose of this story for our larger intention, but the Republic survives. Unlike Italy, which falls to Mussolini the year before, unlike Hungary and Greece and so many others, the German Republic, the Weimar Republic, manages to make its way through this crisis. Eventually, it makes negotiations, and the French and the Belgians leave the Ruhr. A new currency is issued. The old marks are essentially valueless and disappear. The communists are violently repressed, and the right-wing uprisings, like Hitler's own, kind of peter out of their own accord, collapse under the weight of their own incompetence. Now, this is important for us for the obvious reasons that it suggests that the failure of German democracy, let alone the rise of Hitler, was by no means inevitable, right? They'd made it. They'd survived. They'd survived when many other regimes did not, and they survived when they were facing with extraordinarily difficult ensemble of very, very difficult crises. How do they do it? Well, partly they do it because they're fortunate in having in power a group of men who are prepared to fight for the republic, to do what they have to do in order to defend it, to face down its enemies, and to seek solutions for its problems. The most important of those is a man named Gustav Stresemann, not a Republican by sympathy, not really even a Democrat by instinct, but a man who saw, and I think the historical heroes, at least the ones I admire most, are always the ones who do better than you have reason to expect them to. Mm-hmm. And I think this is true of Stresemann. He has a very kind of murky past. He had a lot of not particularly salubrious political instincts. But he sees clearly that any of the alternatives open to the Republic were going to be worse. And that it was necessary to make some very hard choices, to accept a lot of hatred from his enemies, and to do what had to be done to try to keep this regime together. And he was, both in his negotiations with his with Germany's foreign enemies, in his efforts to figure out a way of stabilizing the economy, and his rather ruthless action against those who were using political violence, particularly on the left. In all of these ways, he was ready to take responsibility and to act. In this, he was helped by the President of the Republic, a man who had become the president at the time of the German Revolution, 1918-1919, a man named Friedrich Ebert, a social democrat, a man, again, who had in some ways, very mixed feelings about what was going on, but who, like Stresemann, saw clearly that the Republic was the best chance Germany had for a decent government. Ebert was in many ways, by instincts, much more of a Democrat, much more of a Republican than Stresemann. But he too was prepared to take responsibility. He too was prepared to act. He too was prepared to do what he had to do, to use the powers of the presidency, which were largely matters of emergency powers, to use those in order to support the effort to get a way out of this crisis. It's a success story, a remarkable one. And there follows, following the survival of Germany in 1923, there follows 4 years at least, of quite remarkable stability. Germany joins the League of Nations. It begins a process of reconciliation with its former enemies from the First World War, Stresemann's foreign policy. Economically, Germany begins to recover. The currency holds. There's a good deal of economic growth. Unemployment goes down. And most important of all, the political radicalism, which had both moved towards violence on the far right and the far left, the political radicalism begins to dry up. And here, if I ask you to look at your handout for just a minute and look at the German elections, maybe the easiest one to look at is this one here, mm-hmm. which gives you a somewhat less detail, but somewhat more obvious election. If you look there at the results of the elections, if you don't have one, I have an extra one. No, it's okay. If you look at the elections of 1928, you'll see that the communists are down to about 10%. The Social Democrats, who are the party most committed to the Republic, are at 30. The Catholic Party is at another 15. The Liberals are at 14. And so the Socialists, the Catholics, and the Liberals are all pro-Republican, pro-democratic. The Catholics with some little ambivalence, but we can talk about that later. The other thing to notice about the results of these elections of 1928 is that the Nazis get 3% of the vote. They get a smaller percent of the vote than parties that no one has ever heard of, right? The Hanoverian People's Party and the Württemberg Peasants Group and so forth. They're really right down there on the fringes. And it's another reason to be very skeptical about the inevitability argument, right? If the Nazis were in some way or another the inevitable personification of the German soul, well, why is it that 97% of the Germans don't realize that in 1928? And the result in 1928 is a moderate government, a government based upon the defenders of the Republic, a grand coalition of socialists, Catholics, and liberals, who look like they're in a position now to move towards a period of prolonged stability. Alas, had they had time, they might well have been able to do it. In the middle of a battle once, Napoleon's generals came up to him, and Napoleon said to him, "Ask me for anything but time." And I think that so often is the case in the world of politics, right? Time, the gift of time, the gift of being allowed to have some time to work things out. And those, if I can have a little parenthesis here, those political leaders who don't use the gift of time wisely, I think, bear a terrible historical responsibility. Well, the moderates in the Weimar Republic do not get the gift of time. In October 1929, the stock market crashes on New York, and this reverberates globally. It's particularly difficult in the German case, because a lot of the German, a good deal of the German prosperity had been based upon borrowing money from abroad, particularly from the United States. So that the collapse of the stock market, the collapse of capital markets globally, but particularly in America, had an especially painful impact on Germany. And its impact, its initial impact, was to create intense unemployment. In a highly unionized industrial workforce, unemployment, of course, is a matter of seniority, which means that the people out of work are most often the people who were most recently hired or people who haven't been hired yet. So within a very few months after the stock market crash, you begin to have large-scale unemployment, particularly large-scale unemployment among young workers or people who are about to enter, who hope they can enter the job market. Very disruptive political and economic and social phenomenon. But after all, the German government is still the one elected in the stable years of 1928. It is still a pro-Republican, moderate, broadly based government. And had it been able to stick together, it might well have been able to ride out the worst of the Depression. There were no elections scheduled until 1932, so it had at least 3 years to try to work out some kind of solution to the problems Germany's faced. And here is an important point where the alternatives narrow. Because in 1930, the Depression now 6 months old, the coalition, based on the elections of 1928, collapses. It's not that the people running the political parties don't know that things are bad. It's not that they can't see that the number of street demonstrations and that the potential for crisis is out there. They're not unaware of it. But they're unable to make the kinds of agreements necessary that will keep the coalition going. And not surprisingly, the main issue of contention is unemployment insurance. The liberals, who represent the party of business, feel that they will lose their competitive edge if they are forced to make more contributions to the unemployment insurance on which there is now, of course, ever greater demands. The Social Democrats, the largest, most important member of the coalition, is, after all, the party of industrial labor. And their constituents insist, not unreasonably, that the Social Democrats must defend their interests and provide them with the kinds of support they needed in order to have some chance at least of leading a different life. It's a classic case of economic interest by two parties, both of them committed to their constituents. That's what representative government is about. But it's also a characteristic case of parties who think of themselves as interest groups rather than as being committed to the political purposes of the polity at large. It is part of a long and very complicated set of arguments about representation, arguments that go back to the 18th century. In any case, what happens is that the coalition, unable to agree, breaks up. The ministry is forced to resign. And the president of the Republic, now no longer Friedrich Ebert, who died in 1925, but the field marshal, the victor of the early battles of 1914, Paul von Hindenburg, now elected president. We'll talk a little bit more about Hindenburg in a minute, but he is president, and it is his constitutional responsibility to appoint a new government. Here's Hindenburg. He's not a young man. He's born in 1847. He was a lieutenant in the Wars of Unification in 1871. He's been around a long time. He is a great figure, a national hero, a mythic figure, great authority, well beyond his somewhat modest abilities. In any case, he does what he's supposed to do. He appoints a new government. And he chooses, here again, we get a sense of the alternatives narrowing a bit. He chooses a man named Heinrich Brüning, a member of the Catholic Party, a lawyer, decent man, a moderate man, honest man, a man who it was hoped, because he had been a captain in a machine gun regiment during the war, hoped would have some rapport with the field regiment, with the field marshal, and a man it was hoped who would have the kind of moderate but tough-mindedness that the Republic needed. He was not by instinct a Democrat, but he was certainly in no way a radical. He imagined that he would be able to mobilize what he felt to be respectable, responsible, sensible people behind the Republic. He felt that he understood them and that they would understand him. And that these conflicts that had brought down the Great Coalition were the unnecessary byproduct of letting too many social democrats, too much working class politics into the political sphere. Better to have a more moderate, a more conservative, a more respectable group. To get that, Bruning makes what has got to be classified as one of the great political mistakes of the 20th century. A point at which once again, and this time quite dramatically, the alternatives narrow. Because what Bruning decides to do, in order to get himself a broader coalition from which he can govern, is to dissolve the parliament elected in 1928 and to call for new elections now in the midst of an economic and increasingly intense political crisis. And this is what he does. If you look again at the numbers on our election returns, you'll see just how disastrous this is. The communists increase a little. The socialists lose, but not dramatically. The Catholics stay more or less the same. The liberals lose, but there is a hemorrhaging from the conservative right towards the Nazis. The Nazis, a pitiful 3% 2 years earlier, are now at 18%, the second largest party in the parliament. They pick up a lot of new voters, a lot of young people, a lot of people who hadn't voted before, a lot of people who hadn't voted at all, a lot of people who were voting for the first time, some people who had previously voted for the liberals, lots of people who had previously voted for the conservatives. They picked up mainly Protestants, although not only Protestants, and mainly people who were not in one way or another committed to either of the two major political movements, the Catholics on the one hand and the worker movement on the other. Hitler now, 1930, becomes a major political figure. He's not yet a German citizen, so he can't go into the parliament himself, but he's the leader of the party. He's established that. It's very clear that this is where this is the basis now for his support. It's a vigorous, it gives the impression at least of being a young party, a party filled with people who are prepared to go out and demonstrate and put on uniforms and beat up their political opponents, agitate. So while it has about less than a fifth of the vote, its impact on the public sphere, and the public sphere is considerably amplified by its energy and enthusiasm. But still, disastrous as the decision to have this election in 1930 was, the Nazis are a long, long way from power. They've got 18% of the vote. They've got a lot of energetic people, but they've got some very powerful and important enemies. The labor movement, solidly against them, although divided among themselves. Most, but not all members of the organized political Catholicism. Most of the big business community, not all, some of whom begin to feel some certain sympathy for this, but these guys are not reliable. They're some of them talking about, take this National Socialism stuff serious, take the socialism part seriously. Big business doesn't like people like this. They like people that are much more reliable and predictable. The Army, well, the upper ranges of the Army don't like them either, although among the junior officers there's more sympathy. Civil servants, the same. These are agitators. These aren't our kinds of people. So while the Nazis have by 1930 become a force in political life, they are a long way from power. Bruning tries now, without the basis of support that he'd hoped to get from elections, Bruning is now more or less completely dependent upon President Hindenburg, rules by emergency decree, which the Constitution allows for, tries a number of different efforts to get out of the economic difficulty. He can't. By the way, nobody else could either, but he couldn't. Tries some foreign political initiatives which don't go anywhere. So that the chances that Brüning has either to mobilize the population or to consolidate his position among the political leadership, these are, in the next 2 years, largely wasted. By 1932, there are a series of elections which convulse the political scene. In the first place, Hindenburg, elected now in 1925, Hindenburg has to run again. He's 84 years old. He's still more or less alert. Each passing year, that seems less and less old to me, but anyway, he's still alert, but he's not by any means a vigorous political figure. He finds himself, Hindenburg does, supported by the Democratic left, by the Social Democrats, by the liberals, by the Catholics, because he is the only alternative to Hitler, who now decides to run for president.
Sorry, he is what?
Pardon me?
I didn't hear the last phrase.
Okay, Hitler, in 1932, in the presidential election, Hitler becomes a candidate. So Hindenburg looks to the pro-Republican forces as really the only alternative to Hitler. And he finds himself, Hindenburg does, largely supported by people he doesn't really particularly like. I mean, who are these Social Democrats? I mean, he's a field marshal, for goodness sake. Mm-hmm. But they are the ones who see him, rightly so, as the only way of avoiding the real disaster that a Hitler presidency would involve. Here there are just some posters. This is a Social Democratic poster. Here is a poster for the presidential election, which says, "Vote for Hindenburg, heroes demand heroes," and here's kind of a little doll like Hitler who's saying in a kind of pathetic way, "I'm still the stronger one," whereas the giant Hindenburg holding the world on his shoulders looms above him. Well, Hindenburg wins. A lot of the right wing that had supported Hindenburg in 1945 shifts to Hitler. So Hitler gets, I think he gets not quite 40% of the vote. Hindenburg gets about 53%. So he wins, but he wins beholden to people that he really doesn't much like. And Hindenburg blames Brüning for this. So he fires Brüning. Brüning, who had campaigned vigorously for him, who saw him as the only alternative to Hitler, bears the blame for Hindenburg's great discomfort, for the odd political situation in which he finds himself. He's replaced by the man in the cap, Franz von Papen, a former cavalry officer. You can see by the confident way in which he sits on that horse, who comes in with the idea that he can form a government that would be conservative, not Nazi, but not democratic either. Once again, the alternatives narrow. There's an election in July of 1932. Again, if you look at your numbers, you can see the Nazis do extremely well. They're now at 33%. A long way from a majority, but a long way from that 3% they'd been just 4 years before. And by the summer of 1933, the chances of a parliamentary democracy surviving in Germany, I think, are pretty slim. The alternatives now have narrowed to some kind of a right-wing government, a right-wing authoritarian government, which was very much the norm in Europe when democracies failed. That was the kind of government that Admiral Horthy had in Hungary, was the kind of government that Piłsudski had in Poland, the kind of government, of course, that Franco would have in Spain. And it was the sort of right-wing conservative based on the army and the church and business and holding on to power. And that I think is by July of 1932. Those are the most likely alternatives. The parliament, the German parliament, is largely now paralyzed. It can't really function. The political leadership largely ignores it. And the question is whether people like Papen, here he is with the secretary, with Hindenburg's secretary, a man named Otto Meissner, also a kind of a sinister figure in all of this, riding in the Tiergarten, whether these are the people who will be the heirs to the crisis in which Germany now finds itself. And there's reason to think, as 1932 goes on, that maybe that's going to happen. After all, they've got the support of Hindenburg, far and away the most popular, charismatic, legendary figure. With Hindenburg goes the army. Not a big army, but an army I think that could have handled any street violence that would have been put up against it. And the respectable and conservative members of the state and business and the rest. This possibility that this is what the outcome would be is increased in November of 1932 when there are yet another set of elections. And here, if you look at your numbers, you'll see this very important figure. The Nazis decline. The second, 37% these are the July elections, 33% in the September elections. The first time now that it looks as though the momentum of this movement, very, very rapid but very short-lived, that the momentum of this movement is broken. If we had more time, I could try to analyze what some of these numbers mean. Basically, as far as I can see, what happens is a number of previous Nazi voters either don't vote or return to the conservatives, feeling that the Nazis have become more radicalized, more radical, more violent than they particularly care for.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, usually the parliament, it's there, it was every 4 years they used to do...
Well, but the parliament does elect every 4 years, but what was happening is the government was dissolving the parliament and calling for new elections.
Okay, because of
because
the
they thought, they thought they had a better chance of getting it. The parliament was essentially paralyzed. Papen felt that if he had new elections in November, maybe he could extend his popular support. But that was it. They didn't have to have it. They had to have them every 4 years. It's like Britain, or like any parliamentary system where you have to have it in a certain period, but you don't unless it's dissolved. But okay. Now, so by the end of 1932, the Nazis have apparently peaked. Hindenburg is committed not to try some sort of a conservative authoritarian solution. It looks as though the Republic, while doomed as a parliamentary democracy, might still in some form or another survive without falling into the hands of the Nazis. What happens next are a series of conspiratorial moves in which a relatively small group of people working their way around the President Hindenburg get themselves in a position where they believe that their personal interests are best served by making Hitler the legal head of state in a government that they themselves would dominate. Papen falls. He's replaced in December of 1932 by a man named Kurt von Schleicher, a political soldier, who again is part of this conspiracy, although he himself is trying to split the Nazis, to get one wing of the party on his side, to isolate Hitler and to build a regime based on him. He doesn't make it. Instead, Papen Meisner, the two guys on horseback that we saw, together with a variety of other people, begin negotiating with Hitler. Now, here is Hitler hasn't had a big role in our story, although he is a very important character, and his character is nowhere more important than in these final days, because he's in real difficulty. On the one hand, he's under great pressure from his own party to seize power illegally. He's under great pressure from the paramilitary groups, the people in the stormtroopers and others who say, look, we got enough power, we can do it, we can do it. And when the electoral fortunes begin to decline, their argument becomes even stronger. Look, we better do it now. If we don't do it now, we're going to lose the chance. No, Hitler says, we're not going to do it now. We can't do it now. If we seize power illegally, we'll never be legitimacy. What we do after we get power, that's another thing. But we have to act within the facade of legality. On the other hand, he's under pressure from people who are saying, well, look, become vice chancellor, take a role in the cabinet. Look, you've come a long way. Play a role. And Hitler says, no, I won't. I will only participate in this government if I can be its leader, if I can become the chancellor. So these are the two extremes that he's being pulled towards, and he manages to prevail. He manages to persuade the conspirators that although he is chancellor, and although there are only two other Nazis in the cabinet, that they will be able to call the tune. And it is this set of manipulations and illusions that finally, in January of 1933, result in Hitler's appointment as chancellor. Here he is, the day of his appointment. This is, of course, Goering next to him, receiving adulation from the huge crowds of Nazi supporters that throng through the streets. And here's the New York Times, which buys very much the argument that the conspirators themselves were making. Hitler made chancellor, but coalition cabinet limits power. Centrists hold balance. Here's the cabinet. Most of them, as you can see, respectable men in well-fitting suits. Only 3 Nazis in the cabinet. And here, a month later, or 2 months later, is Hitler dressed up in a morning coat and Field Marshal President von Hindenburg in all his military splendor, shaking hands and consolidating the alliance that in fact brought Hitler to power. Well, what happens next is not our story, but you can guess. Right? Hitler uses his power to isolate the conservatives, push them to one side, takes over the police, takes over the army, and within a very, very short time, his erstwhile allies are either dead, like General von Schleicher, who's murdered, or marginalized and out of power. So that within a year, the whole regime has now fallen into the hands of Hitler and his followers. Lessons. Lessons, as you can see, embedded in the story, but lessons there nonetheless. Individuals matter. I've always felt that one of the most implausible theories of history was the one in which said individual action doesn't count. That seems to me not only counter to everything we know as historians, but everything we know in real life. Individuals matter. They don't matter always entirely. There are other things at work, no doubt about it. Stresemann, Ebert, Hindenburg, Schleicher, Brüning, Hitler himself, all of them are vital. And had any one of them not been in position, had there been a different president, had Stresemann not died prematurely, had Hitler been run over by a bus, any number of things the story would have turned out quite differently. Institutions matter. The fact that German political parties, and for historical reasons that I didn't go into, the fact that the German political parties regarded themselves largely as interest groups, which came together in that critical decision in 1930 to break up the coalition. This is a fact of institutional path dependence, to use the social science term, which had great consequence. The role of the army, the role of the civil service, all of this in institutional terms played a part. And finally, this is something that I didn't talk about, but which I think is an extremely important thing to bring up at the end. Finally, the international environment. The fact that the European powers did not recognize that it was in their interests to try to do something to defend the Republic. The fact that the political environment, the political climate internationally, lent itself to fantasies of violence and radicalism. All of that, I think, undermined democracy, not simply in Germany, but elsewhere as well. Individuals, institutions, the international environment, all of them, I think, in ways that are critical, play a role. But in the end, what we see from this story, and this is, I think, what we see historically again and again, are a series of people like us, like our leaders, caught in situations that they only partly understand, making decisions, the implications of which they only partly see, acting according to their own interests, their own illusions, their own efforts, their own values. And in this way, I'm always reminded when I tell stories like this of that famous line from Karl Marx, in which Marx says, men make history, but they don't make the history they set out to make. And I think this is true of the people we've been talking about today. What happened is a result of their intentions. What happens is, in one larger sense, in as much as this matters at all, their responsibility. But few of them, except for Hitler himself and a few of them around him, few of them wanted what they got. Few of them expected to get what they got. And in that sense, Marx, I think, was right.